My name is Jennifer Wallace. I'm 40, and the sound of my father's laughter still echoes in that hospital hallway where he told the doctors I was just his unemployed daughter who lives in a fantasy world. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I stood there in civilian clothes, jeans, a plain grey sweater, and worn sneakers, watching my father command the room like he always had. Dr. Martinez was explaining Mom's condition, her third heart attack in 2 years, and Dad was holding court with his usual authority. He owned 3 car dealerships across Nevada, employed 200 people, and never let anyone forget it. Jennifer here has been telling people she's some kind of soldier, he said with that familiar, dismissive chuckle, not even looking at me. 30 years old and still playing dress up, if you can believe it. I was actually 40, but Dad had a way of making everyone around him feel smaller, younger, less significant. The nurses smiled politely, the way people do when they're uncomfortable, but trying to be kind. Dr. Martinez nodded and continued discussing Mom's treatment options, but I could see the judgment in his eyes. Another family member who couldn't handle reality. The thing is, I'd been trying to tell them about my career for 15 years, not boasting, not seeking approval, just basic family updates. How's work, Jenny? My sister Melissa would ask at Christmas. And when I'd mention deployments or training exercises, Dad would interrupt with stories about his latest business acquisition. When I tried to explain why I couldn't make Easter dinner because of a classified operation, he'd roll his eyes and say, "More army games, I suppose." It started innocently enough. After high school, I'd enlisted instead of going to college like my siblings. Dad called it running away from responsibility. When I made sergeant at 22, he told people I was still figuring things out. When I got accepted to officer candidate school, he said I was finally growing up. Maybe, but somewhere along the way, his dismissal became willful ignorance. He stopped asking about my work entirely. At family gatherings, he'd introduce my brother, Marcus, as the lawyer, my sister as the doctor, and me as still in the army. I think when relatives asked what I did, he'd change the subject or make jokes about how I liked to play with tanks. The truth was more complicated than anyone in my family understood. After OCS, I'd been commissioned as a second lieutenant in military intelligence. I spent 3 years analyzing terrorist communications in Afghanistan, then another 2 training Iraqi security forces. By 30, I was a captain running counterintelligence operations across the Middle East. At 35, I made major and transferred to the Pentagon, where I spent 4 years coordinating intelligence sharing between agencies. Last year, I'd pinned on my colonel's eagles. Not that Dad would know. He'd stopped opening my letters around 2018, after I'd sent photos from a change of command ceremony, where I took over an intelligence battalion. He'd glanced at them and said, "Nice costume party, kiddo." I'd stopped trying to explain after that, but here's what really twisted the knife. He was proud of me once. When I was 8 years old, he'd taken me to his dealership and shown me off to his employees. "This is my little general," he'd say, because I'd organized all my toy soldiers by rank and unit. "She's going to run the world someday." 25 years later, he couldn't fathom that I actually might be. The hospital became our family's second home over the next 3 weeks. Mom was stable, but needed round-clock care, and we took shifts. During the day, Dad would hold meetings with doctors and specialists, making decisions with the same confidence he brought to business deals. In the evenings, Marcus would review medical documents with his lawyer's precision. Melissa would discuss treatment options with her medical expertise, and I would sit quietly in the corner, the unemployed daughter who lived in a fantasy world. Jennifer's free all the time. Dad would tell the staff when scheduling conflicts arose. "She doesn't have a real job." When I tried to explain that I had limited availability due to work obligations, he'd wave me off. Army reserves or something. Nothing important. I wasn't reserves. I was active duty, assigned to the Defense Intelligence Agency Strategic Operations Center. My days were spent briefing senators on global threat assessments and coordinating with CIA station chiefs. My phone would buzz with encrypted messages from Langley, from CENTCOM, from field operatives in places I couldn't mention. But Dad saw me checking my phone and assumed I was playing games. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in October. Mum had taken a turn for the worse, and the whole family was gathered in her room. Dad was pacing by the window. Marcus was reading medical journals, and Melissa was adjusting Mom's. I was sitting beside her bed holding her hand when my phone vibrated. It was a priority message from my operations officer. Colonel Wallace SecDef wants your Syria briefing moved to 08 tomorrow. Presidential daily brief prep at 1400. I glanced at the message and started mentally rearranging my schedule. I'd need to leave by 6 o'clock in the morning to make it back to DC. Brief the Secretary of Defense on our latest intelligence from Syria, then spend the afternoon preparing intelligence summaries for the President's daily briefing. It was the kind of responsibility that kept me awake at night, knowing that my analysis might influence decisions that affected thousands of lives. But Dad saw me looking at my phone and exploded. "For Christ's sake, Jennifer," he said loud enough to make the other patients' families look over. "Your mother is dying and you're playing on your phone. What is wrong with you?" "Dad, you're just what? Checking Facebook, playing games. Your mother needs you here, not lost in whatever fantasy world you've created for yourself." Marcus looked up from his journal. "Maybe put the phone away, Jen. This is more important than whatever hobby you're into now." Melissa nodded in agreement. "She's right, Dad. Jenny's always been a little detached from reality." The words hit me like a physical blow. Detached from reality, as if coordinating intelligence operations across 3 continents was some kind of elaborate delusion, as if the 15 years I'd spent serving my country, the classified operations I'd planned, the lives I'd helped save, all of it was just Kylie. I looked around the room at my family. Dad was glaring at me with that familiar disappointment. Marcus had already returned to his reading, dismissing me entirely. Melissa was adjusting Mom's blankets, shaking her head at my selfishness. And Mom, weak, barely conscious Mom, opened her eyes and looked at me with something that might have been recognition. Or maybe it was just the morphine. "I have to go," I said quietly. Dad scoffed. "Of course you do. Run away again. That's what you always do when things get real." I stood up, kissed Mom's forehead, and walked toward the door. But I stopped and turned back. "Dad, I need you to understand something. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to brief the Secretary of Defense on intelligence operations in Syria. Tomorrow afternoon, I'm going to help prepare materials for the President's daily briefing. And next week, I'm going to deploy to Germany to coordinate intelligence sharing with NATO allies. That's not a fantasy. That's my job." He laughed, that same dismissive chuckle that had followed me for 15 years. "Right, Jennifer? You're going to brief the President, and I'm having lunch with Elvis." Marcus snorted. Melissa rolled her eyes. Even the nurse looked uncomfortable. After the briefing, which went well, resulting in increased surveillance assets being allocated to the region, I had lunch with a State Department colleague who was heading to Damascus next month. We discussed visa requirements and security protocols, the kind of mundane details that make international intelligence cooperation possible. Then I spent 3 hours in a secure conference room, helping prepare intelligence summaries for the President's daily brief. The PDB is a classified document that lands on the President's desk every morning, containing the most critical intelligence assessments from across the government. My section covered Middle Eastern threats, and I was particularly focused on a developing situation in Lebanon that could affect American interests. At 6 p.m., I finally checked my phone. 17 missed calls from Dad. The first voicemail was typical. "Jennifer, your mother's asking for you. Stop whatever you're doing and get back here." The second was more urgent. "Jennifer, I don't know what game you're playing, but we need you at the hospital. Call me back." The third was different. Jennifer, there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Can you please call me? It's important." I called back and Dad answered on the first ring. "Jennifer, Jesus Christ, where are you?" "I'm in DC, Dad. I told you I had to work today." "Work?" His voice was strange, shaky. "Jin, I need to ask you something. And I need you to be honest with me. Are you really? I mean, do you actually work for the government?" I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What happened, Dad?" "There was a man here today at the hospital. He was asking about you." "What kind of man?" "Military, full uniform, lots of ribbons. He had 2 other men with him, also in uniform. They came to Mom's room looking for you." I closed my eyes. My operations officer had probably sent someone to check on me after I didn't respond to this morning's messages. It was standard protocol. When a senior officer missed scheduled communications, what did he say? He said, Dad's voice trailed off. He said he was looking for Colonel Wallace. And when I told him there was no colonel here, just my daughter Jennifer, who's unemployed, he showed me a photograph of you in uniform. The silence stretched between us. "He called you, ma'am," Dad continued, and he saluted the photograph. I didn't know what to say. For 15 years, I'd tried to bridge the gap between my military life and my family. I'd sent photos, shared stories, tried to explain what I did, but Dad had built such a solid wall of dismissal that even direct evidence was hard for him to process. "Dad, the nurse at the desk knew who you were," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "When I told her what happened, she said she'd looked you up online. She showed me articles, news stories. There's a picture of you shaking hands with General Milley." I remembered that photo. It was taken after I briefed the Joint Chiefs on Chinese intelligence activities in the South China Sea. Someone from the Public Affairs Office had snapped it and released it to the press as part of a story about women in military leadership roles. "Jenny," Dad said, and his voice was breaking. "Are you really a colonel?" "Yes, Dad, I'm really a colonel." More silence. "Then the man who came looking for you, he said you missed a scheduled check-in. He said it was unusual for you not to respond to operational communications. I was with you at the hospital. My phone was on silent," he said. Dad stopped, took a breath. He said, "You were one of the most important intelligence officers in the military." He said, "You briefed generals and senators and people I can't even imagine." I felt tears starting to form, which was ridiculous. I briefed heads of state, coordinated operations in war zones, and managed intelligence assets across hostile territories. But my father finally understanding what I did for a living was somehow harder to handle than any of that. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "I tried, Dad. For 15 years, I tried. But you never, you dress like what? Like I'm not important enough to wear a uniform to visit my dying mother." The words came out harsher than I intended, but they were true. I'd worn civilian clothes to the hospital because I'd learned over the years that my family was more comfortable when I looked ordinary, when I looked like someone they could understand and dismiss. "Jenny," Dad said, and I could hear him crying, "I'm so sorry." That's when I broke, sitting in a secure conference room in the Pentagon, wearing a uniform that represented 15 years of service, crying because my father finally believed I was worth something. 2 days later, I was back in Nevada. Mum was stable, and the doctors were optimistic about her recovery. I walked into her hospital room wearing my dress blue uniform, complete with colonels, eagles, ribbons, and badges that told the story of my career. I'd just come from a farewell ceremony at Nellis Air Force Base, where I had been honored for my coordination of a joint intelligence operation that had disrupted a major terrorist network, whose dad was sitting beside Mum's bed when I arrived. He looked up at me and stood immediately, his eyes taking in every detail of my uniform: the Combat Action Badge from Afghanistan, the Defense Superior Service Medal from my Pentagon assignment, the Expert Infantryman Badge from my early enlisted days, the parachutist wings from airborne school. 15 years of service condensed into ribbons and metal. "Jenny," he said, and his voice was full of something I'd never heard before. Respect. "Hi, Dad." He walked toward me slowly, like he was seeing me for the first time. And maybe he was. "I called your commanding officer," he said. "I wanted to apologize for," he gestured helplessly, "for everything, for not believing you, for not supporting you, for being such a terrible father." I